There's not many experiences better than realizing the new book you're reading is going to be a masterpiece that will stand the test of time, just as you begin reading it. You are actually disappointed when you hit the last page because there needs to be more. There has to be more. What little was given could not be nearly enough. Let me introduce you to one such book, Tall Tales of the Wee Folk, written originally by John Nephew. The definitive look at the world of the Fae and the Sylvan Races in Mystara. Not just Mystara, this book will hold its own against any similar book from D&D of any setting. Hold its own is the wrong term. It's like when you're watching the upstart challenger against the weathered champion in the boxing ring, and 30 seconds into the first round, you realize there isn't going to be a second round. That's how other books about the Fae hold up to Tall Tales. Welcome to Mystara. I'm Mr. Welch. It's time to walk into that fairy ring. Tall Tales was the first of the Creature Crucible line, a series of books that introduced new playable creatures to Mystara, each fitting a theme. Obviously, this theme was Fae and Sylvan creatures. Again, it was written by John Nephew. The immortal Keith Parkinson did the cover art, and Valerie Valisac was responsible for the interior work. Similar to the Gazetteer, it was a pair of books, a 64-page source book and a 32-page adventure book, with a fold-out cover, including a map of the Good Kingdom, and quite a few references to all the different character classes. The biggest draw of the book was the mind-blowing 13 new races at the time. Sure, Orcs of Thar added 10 new races, but they were meant to be played as the bad guys, and all of those races the players were already familiar with. Tall Tales introduced new creatures that had never graced the inside of a D&D book before. Remember, this is BECMI, races or classes. The book stole heavily from, well, everybody. Greek myth, Arthurian legend, Shakespeare, Welsh folklore, Irish folklore, and some stuff that was made up just for this book. It also introduced us to negative experience levels, something we hadn't seen since the Cavalier and Unearthed Arcana. The races were split between Sylvan and Fae races. The Sylvan races were things like centaurs, fauns, dryads, and treants, and a few others. They were fantasy creatures that lived in a sylvan environment, as the name suggests. They were fanciful, but they were still mortal. Nephew did make a few changes to existing creatures while greatly expanding their lore, so treants and dryads were made into mortal creatures rather than fae like in other settings. But the major draw for a lot of people was the fae. Playable brownies, redcaps, pixies, sprites, leprechauns, pukas, she, wood imps, and wood drakes. If you ever wanted to trigger Rennie accents, let your players pick a character from this book. The origin of the Fae in Mystara was created specifically by Tall Tales. With one exception, they are never mentioned again in another Mystara book, though it's got quite a few debates, discussions, and diatribes started over on the Vaults of Pandius. A long time ago, entropy ruled all, but it was called the Sphere of Integration, aka the Sphere of Chaos or the Sphere of Life. As chaos reigned, random things naturally happened. One of those things was the creation of life itself. Then life took up the other spheres of power, but the immortals of life that existed back then decided not to aid the immortals of entropy in killing off the new primitive creatures that threatened their power. These immortals of life helped the creatures evolve until they split off, and they became the oldest immortals themselves. But those that didn't take a side became the Fae, immortals in their own right but trapped in a cycle of rebirth. When they died, they immediately reappeared in a new body. The Fae could not truly be destroyed, only forced to regrow their form. If that sounds confusing, the story was given from a point of view character that might not have been a reliable narrator. Reincarnation was the first of the Fae powers, and while they are immortal because of their cycle of rebirth, dropping to 0 hit points was a bad idea, because it could take years before the Fae could reincarnate completely into a new body. They would keep their personality, though their memories might fade. If you stab a pixie, he's not going to show up outside your window the next day. Though 20 years later, you might want to start looking both ways before crossing a street. Any street. Fae have the ability to turn invisible to mortals, though they can still see each other. This is an at-will power. It is very prone to abuse, so Dungeon Masters be warned if you let people use this book. Fae have Second Sight, which is a limited form of true sight that only works on other fairies. They can tell if another creature is a fairy, even if the other fairy is invisible, disguised, polymorphed, or similarly changed. They do take extra damage from iron, but it's a slow lingering effect from constant exposure rather than extra points of damage from a single weapon. Still, they will go out of their way to avoid iron as much as they can. Fae forms will last about 1,000 years before they will be forced to reincarnate into a new body, often taking on a new appearance and often new mannerisms. The Fae have a lot of ancient grudges, as you can imagine. They absolutely hate the undead and will usually attack them on sight or get somebody who will. Necromancy is expressly forbidden, and any Fae that takes part in it will be made to suffer. Frequent penalties include forced polymorph into an inanimate object, or for worse offenders, being turned into an undead creature for a life cycle, typically a banshee. While this sounds like an upgrade, for a Fae, it's pure torture. Being stripped of the ability to experience joy and only know sorrow is a fate worse than death for the goodly folk. The fairies also have a very strained relation with the immortals, as they have no need for them. They can't quest for immortality themselves, they can't become clerics. They just see immortals as another creature. Incredibly powerful creatures, but definitely not divine. This lack of respect goes both ways, as the immortals gain nothing from the Fae either. They don't openly hate each other, and will help out if a crisis is big enough. They're more like neighbors that don't have the time for one another. As long as the other side doesn't interfere too much with the other's life, everybody's willing to ignore each other. Of the goodly folk that are introduced in the book, brownies are the helpful house Fae that love to do chores, with redcaps being the unhelpful Fae that love to commit felonies. They both use the same rules, despite one being happy and cheerful, and the other one being happy and cheerful and wearing someone else's face as a cloak. Both can turn invisible to mortals, but redcaps prefer their victims to see them. Both act like fighters in the rules, and both start off at negative 2000 XP as PCs. While brownies have no real special rules outside of the fairy default, redcaps take a decent amount of damage from holy water and tend not to attack overtly religious people. They can both try to use magic items they normally couldn't, but the odds of actually getting it to work is pretty small, capping off at 30% at their highest level. Leprechauns are the smiths and craftsmen of the fairy world. They have limited spellcasting abilities, capping at level 4 spells. Their invisibility has one drawback: it doesn't work if they're being watched, but if they can distract their guests, they can immediately turn invisible. While it's possible to play a leprechaun, their pitiful hit points and limited magic means most players keep looking when they're building their character. Something about 1d2 starting hit points until you gain 2000 XP, and then it's just another 1d2. But after second level, it's 1d4 hit points all the way, baby, for the rest of the game. The leprechauns are led by King Oberon, who rules the distant nation of Phelan, of which all we know is it lies on another continent. He's a workaholic that keeps the workshops going, but he's starting to look at retirement so he can actually see the world. Pixies and Sprites are lumped together as similar creatures, with the main difference of Pixies being fighters and Sprites being wizards. They are both tiny creatures who share the standard Fae abilities. They can fly, turn invisible, and Pixies can try to work magic items that aren't meant for them, though the chance of success again is never high. Despite their small size, Pixies do have a lot of hit points, and they can wear any armor their size. They can remain invisible even while attacking, compared to every other Fae who has to become visible. As fighters, their one major problem is damage, because a sword the size of a toothpick does minimal damage. Sprites, on the other hand, are all about magic. They get a wizard's hit points, and they get Fae magic up to level 7. 5 Sprites can work together to cast a curse, and they get a few spells at an earlier level than other classes. Of the Fey races, Sprites are one of the more playable and were pretty popular back in the day. They've got all the regular weaknesses of magic users, but the ability to turn invisible at will is tremendously helpful. Plus, they leveled up slightly faster than regular magic users. Pukas were one of the weirdest playable races ever made for D&D. Anywhere. It's an anthropomorphic animal, only instead of a dog humanoid, it's just a dog that stands on 2 legs, or a platypus, or a lemur, or a hippo. In short, it's an animal that acts like a human, only that it can turn invisible like other fairies, and it can seriously mess with time. And Puka invisibility is the best invisibility. They can decide who they are invisible to or not. They can make themselves invisible to everyone in the tavern, except for the drunk at the end of the bar. Or they can make themselves invisible to just one guy who thinks he's gone off the deep end and unable to see the rather dashing talking armadillo dressed like the Emperor of Thyatis that's the life of the party. Pukas love their vices. Almost all of them will have a flask on them somewhere. Gambling and smoking are pretty common among them as well. Pukas make for fast friends. They love causing chaos wherever they go, but they're never malicious. If a party gets boring, expect the Puka to start a pie fight. Their most feared ability is their habit of messing with time, speeding things up, slowing things down, and for the most powerful, stopping it altogether. This allows them to set up chaos, or in the worst case scenario, get out of it just as easily. They have a laundry list of abilities, taking up more than a single page just to list. From past experience, these things can be the life of the party, or can be so obnoxious they'll break up the gaming group. So use them with caution. Then we come to the Sidhe. S-I-D-H-E, for those not familiar with Gaelic spelling, because if the English can't spell a word, they can't steal it. These were by far the most popular of the Fey races, being the classic goodly folk and the source of a lot of explaining to people unfamiliar with them in Mystara. She represent what would be half-elves in other settings, but they are related to neither humans nor elves. They can't interbreed. They aren't actually humanoids, instead this being the form they chose a very long time ago. They love mortal culture. They try to act like mortals in their courts, though they famously tend to get a lot of things wrong. They can never copy the mortal society correctly, as they make changes to the customs or habits that make more sense to them. They're known for dressing in fashion disasters that you can see from a mile away. If they put on a performance, it can last for days. Or they will take a romantic tryst way too far. They usually aren't trying to be harmful, but they don't understand why mortals would stop doing something that they enjoy. They are one of the most numerous of the Fey races, and while not common in mortal society, there's enough of them that they're not going to be burned at the stake as a monster by frightened townfolk. Mechanically, they can breathe water, cast fairy spells, but they can't use iron weapons or armor. The Wood Drakes are another race that could probably never be converted to another edition easily. These are a small dragon-like creature that can change into the shape of an elf or a halfling at will. They are one of the 3 drake forms, with mandrakes and cold drakes also existing, which can turn either into a human or a dwarf or a gnome in the case of a cold drake. Despite their draconic appearance, they are fey creatures, having chosen their form after the Great Rain of Fire. The drakes saw the near destruction of the world and decided to take a new form on their next reincarnation to prevent future apocalypses. They infiltrated various mortal societies that sprang up after the disaster and actively worked to prevent people from blowing up the world in the future. Drakes love chaos. They hate the status quo and they work to keep societies from stagnating by introducing new ideas and methods. Mechanically, they are one of the toughest creatures to play, having 3 negative levels that must be bought off before you get to the really good stuff. They gain the ability to ignore magic spells a number of times a day per level. They get decent rogue skills, and they also have enhanced saving throws. Despite all this, they are still difficult to play properly, because too many people see the chaos-loving aspect and play them as Vivian from the Young Ones. And a little Vivian goes a really long way in a D&D campaign. The Fae have a pecking order in terms of power, and the goodly folk are ruled over by King Oberon and Queen Titania from the Fae court. There's a lot of creatures stolen directly from Shakespeare that appear here as well, including Robin Goodfellow and Queen Mob, though she's mentioned once in a different part of the book, and absolutely nothing save her name is mentioned about her. Rounding out the council is Lotus, a dryad who is bonded to a large birch tree where Oberon holds court in the material plane. Ullerhole, a wise centaur who serves as a tutor and sage for anyone who approaches her. She's a favorite of Oberon because of her knack for prophecy. Papa Silenus is an old faun who wanders in and out of the court. He's never sober, and he is always welcomed because when he's totally blotto, he tends to mutter out rather accurate prophecies. Turk is one of the sentient owl race called the Sow, whose knowledge of the various Fey races is quite extensive, especially that of the newly formed drakes. They might have assumed the form only 4,000 years ago, but in fairy terms, that's as good as yesterday. Lastly, there's Khorbdi, a rabbit puka, who helps maintain Oberon's court by keeping order through his time manipulation powers. Aided by his magical timepiece, he can slow time inside the court to a crawl, so mortals making petitions to the timeless Fae don't wither and die long before they get to speak with Oberon. There are numerous realms of Fae that are mentioned in name only. The Emperor of the Fairies has an impressive title, and rules in a faraway land, but nothing else is known about him. Gwenap Nuth of Anwen is a frequent visitor to Oberon, but again is only mentioned by name. Of course, you have to really work to make that connection to Welsh folklore, as Anwen was the Welsh afterlife, which doesn't make sense for a race that doesn't know death. There's a lot of Fae-related references that are never fully explained. The Duan Shi are mentioned multiple times, but the difference between the other Shi is never fully explained. In lore, they're just the Irish fairies. Nephew did his homework on the lore of the Fae, but unfortunately for this book, there was nowhere enough room to explain everything he wanted to say, like what the difference between a Wrath and a Dun Castle is. But he did devote an entire page to the different types of fairy buildings. The book does mention various fairy realms that can be accessed through a variety of methods like rings, magical stones, or even lakes, but nothing of substance is given about them other than the fact they exist. When you cross into one, you're no longer on the material plane, but you have entered the Good Kingdom, the realm of the Fae. The few times the Good Kingdom is mentioned, it's only a few sentences. A large golden castle that's found inside of a much smaller hill. There's an underwater palace made of cloth, or a forest of eternal spring where the sun runs backwards in the sky. Some decent imagery, but there's not much for showing off the rest of the world. But what Tall Tales lacked in detail, the Mystara crowd was more than happy to fill in and share. Concepts like the Archfey, the Unseelie, the rest of Oberon's court were added on the vaults. More exotic Fae that were mentioned in previous Mystara books, such as the Faedorn, the Silver Warriors, the Flitterlings, the Crones of Chaos, were assigned their place in the hierarchy of the She court. Tall Tales grabbed the imagination of its fanbase, and they expanded it with the new lore. The concept that there was a race that was tied to the fate of Mystara, but in ways that the mortals couldn't fathom, gave new adventures and intrigues for dungeon masters to exploit and expand on. Of course, this being Mystara, Tall Tales also created a huge number of continuity problems. First, starting with the addition of a race of creatures that were as powerful as the Immortals in fluff, and mechanically weaker than the Emperor of Thyatis in rules. To continue the time-honored tradition of self-enclosed books, the She and other newly introduced races were never mentioned again in any future book, except for a She Queen that was found in the Hollow World, and not coincidentally in a source book that was also written by John Nephew. The Fae were mentioned to have kingdoms all over the map, but this isn't retroactive, so even future maps of the world didn't add any new markers showing us where these kingdoms are. The game introduced new concepts that never got explored, like the Changelings. Unlike the race from Oberon that's been borged into the Forgotten Realms and now the multiverse, Mystara Changelings were taken straight from folklore. The Fae steal a human child to raise as their own, or a child of any race. A polymorphed animal or object is left in the place of the child, and the replacement will then sicken and die. The child is raised to adulthood and released into the world, gifted with the power of second sight and hidden knowledge of Fae lore. The reason for this subterfuge is that the Faes can't become immortal themselves, but they want immortals friendly to them on their terms. So if Changeling can achieve immortality, then the Fae have effectively made one of their own into one of the most powerful mortal entities in the multiverse. It's not a foolproof plan, but they have got all the time in the world to get it right. There's a lot in this book that is changed by Dungeon Masters, because some of the creatures as presented don't make a lot of sense. Things like the Leprechauns normally being lawful creatures. The book suggests all of Oberon's court is held in a small clearing in Alfheim, but then presents the Fey domain as an impossibly large otherworld. Go with the Fairy Kingdom rather than the Alfheim clearing. It's more fun that way. The book mentions the Unseelie, but doesn't give any examples, though Mystara does have hags, crones, imps of a Fey variety, and several fairy races that can be of any alignment. The vaults do have numerous articles on the possibility of expanding the setting using the Fey, far more than I can possibly mention in a single video. One problem I have mentioned in other videos is the temptation to run an all Sylvan/Fey party. This can be done, but you have to take serious precautions because of a variety of problems you are going to encounter. Some creatures like the wood imps don't play well with others. Others are way too large to be useful, like treants. You aren't going dungeon crawling with centaurs. Because of the negative levels that many races have to start with, some of the more powerful creatures are going to need a lot of XP before they can start to level up, and their basic powers won't unlock until everyone has several levels on them. A Leprechaun has a maximum of 2 hit points plus con bonus at first level, and it's a fighting type class. A wizard is 5th level before a treant gets its starting powers. You can see the problem. Tall Tales is a classic book. It set the tone for the creature crucibles and tapped into the imagination of people who had grown up on the tales of the fair folk from their ancestors. Nephew did his homework on the background. It is reflected in every page of the book. If the book does have a glaring weakness, it's too short. There are a lot of mentions and asides that could have been expanded out even further. You can tell that he wanted to include even more, but the hard page count hampered him. A sequel for this would have been perfect, or even a full-blown nation book, but that was not to be. Second edition was looming, and BECMI was not long for the world. If you want a copy, you can get a PDF on the DM's Guild for $5, but there's no print on demand. The book goes for $75 on the usual sites intact, and while steep, the book is worth that. It's your call. Next remaster is Top Ballista, which was definitely part of Mystara's silly phase. The focus this time was on flying creatures and their wonderful machines. It also introduced gnomes as PCs for the first time. But until then, remember, it's okay to be openly Fey.